Shalom, everyone, and welcome to our Shabbat night study, lesson 2, Noach. And we're going to have an exciting time with the word on tonight. Thank you for joining me for our study. For some of you, year 2, for others, year 6. But we've changed the format a little bit let me cut my music off. Let me cut it off. All right. Right. Okay. So we changed our format a little bit. We're going to introduce some books that are different from books that we may have studied before. I don't know how this shows up to you, but this is one of the books that I use as part of the Ethiopian Bible, which is actually over 800 years older than the Protestant Bible that most of us were raised 66 books. Well, this Ethiopian Bible has, in some cases, 88 books, and I have a shortened form of those books that are not included in our Protestant Bible. And so we're introducing that for information that gives us a little bit more in-depth understanding of what was really going on, because we're going through long periods of time, and many times it's hard to comprehend everything that was actually happening. And so we have a difficult time answering questions concerning certain aspects of the scriptures that have these long periods of time as part of the text itself. And so what we try to do then is touch on some of that to give us a more in-depth understanding of what's going on. We sent out an outline, and on the outline, which is what we follow, but I'm expecting that everyone will look at the outline, and you'll see on there that this time we're even going to introduce the book of Enoch. And we'll see where Enoch is on our chart as we go in, because there's a lot about Enoch that many times we will miss. And because the scriptures aren't, other than a couple of places, and especially in the New Testament, Jude, we wouldn't normally utilize the book of Enoch because it's not part of what is called the canon of scripture of the Protestant Bible. But once again, the Ethiopian Bible is 800 years older than the Protestant Bible. And in the beginning, the Catholic Bible included many of the books that are called apocryphal or hidden books in their canon of scripture. And so we just use it for information to help us understand a little bit and understand the gaps and fill it in with information so that we're better equipped to, in fact, give others information. So we're going to have a great time. And as you look at your outline, you'll see that we're going from Genesis 6, verse 9, all the way to chapter 11, verse 32. And we're going to try to do it by the outline, but I expect you during your study time to read all of that. We're not going to go line upon line this time because we wanted to introduce additional information. And so we're going to be in the book of Jubilees, chapters 5 through 8. Then in the Brit Hadasha, or the New Testament, we're going to read Matthew 24, 36 through 44. And all of these are companion studies for what the Torah lesson wants us to understand and read and study. And so then we're going to have the book of Enoch, excuse me, chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. And there's more, but we're going to stop there because we don't want to go too far into the understanding that is provided in both the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch. So with that, we're going to take communion, and then we're going to begin our lesson. Remember, we talked about the fact that whenever we gather, Yeshua in, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, began to teach us certain information regarding what happens when we gather together and eat and assemble ourselves together under the name of Yeshua, and we usually fellowship with a meal because that's part of the fellowship itself. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, he said, Shaul said, for what I received from the Lord is just what I passed on to you, that the Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And after he had made the barakah, or the blessing, well, we're going to go through what that blessing really was in Hebrew, because that's what he would have made the blessing in. He broke it and said, this is my body. And we're going to go through that. But the blessing that he gave before the bread and then before the wine would have been in Hebrew, Baruch atah Yehovah Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamotzi lehem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Jehovah, our Elohim, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And so with that, he took bread and passed it around and told them each to take a piece, for the bread was, he said, this is my body, which is broken just for you. And he told them to then break up this loaf he passed around and eat. And so we eat. He said, do this always and do it in remembrance of me. And so we do that. Then as we continue, he said, he passed around a cup and he said, this cup is the new covenant affected by my blood. He said, now do this, drink this, always in remembrance of me. So the blessing he said before they drank it would be, Baruch atah Yehovah Eloheinu melech ha'olam borei pari hagafein. Blessed are you, Jehovah, our Elohim, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. Then they passed it around and told him to drink it, for it was symbolic of his blood that was shed for the remission of our sins and for our covenant relationship with him. And so we drink. All right. So now we're going to get into our slide presentation and get into our lesson for tonight. And get your outlines, because we're going to be using that to kind of go through it as quickly as we can. But at the very same time, we're going to get into some of the book of Jubilees that you'll see right up under the first. We give you 7 sessions for 7 days of study, and you have about 6 days of study we're trying to give you. But at the end of it, we have what? First part of our session will be from Genesis 6, verse 9, all the way to verse 22. So you're expected to read that. Then we're going to give a little commentary on that. And we're going to go through Jubilees chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, and verses 22 and 23. So with that, let us get to our shared screen for our lesson for today. And okay, let me get out the way, but it never does what it's supposed to do. So we're going to get to our slideshow presentation. And this is lesson 2 from Genesis 6, verse 9, all the way to 11, verse 32. This is October 24th, 2025, and this is our Shabbat night lesson. And so in the first part of our session, before we get there, I did want to bring up some of the commentary about some of what we're going to be going through tonight in our study. One, we're going to look at our chart and kind of go down and see the extension of the lifetimes, which we will notice that are in this part of our lesson. And just before, in lesson 1, it gave us kind of the lineage all the way up to Noah. And then we go from Noah all the way to Abraham. And so we have a total of basically 20 lessons. Let me see if I kept those papers. I was supposed to. I don't see them. So just one second. Let me see if I put them in my, I'll be right back. All right, I'm sorry. But I wanted to get my other chart out. I thought I had it, but I didn't. So, and I didn't put it as part of my big screen. But in any case, last week we went from Adam, following the priestly line through Seth, all the way to Noah. Tonight we're going to go from Noah all the way to Abraham by the end of chapter 11. And we're going to see that the 20th generation of the priestly line from Adam all the way to Abraham, there were 20 generations. And we could follow those generations and see how information was transferred from one generation to the next. The first chart we're going to look at as we get into our lesson is going to be from what we call our companion study, which is called Haftarah in Hebrew. And the Haftarah study was Isaiah chapter 54, verses 1 through 10. The companion means that this aspect of our study of Noah is referred to in this particular chapter of Isaiah. So we're going to look through that right quick and go through that with you. And it starts 54, verse 1, sing, barren woman who has never had a child, burst into song, shout for joy. You have never been in labor. For the deserted wife will have more children than the woman who is living with her husband, says Jehovah. So this whole concept that we're going to see is basically where Jehovah tells Noah that he is going to destroy all life on the earth except for Noah and 7 others, which is Noah's wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, and all other human flesh, even animals, anything that breathes air is going to be destroyed in this flood. Well, Isaiah is telling the children of Israel that even though you're going to go off into captivity, Jehovah is not abandoning you. He's just allowing you to be taken away because of your disobedience. So in this particular text, he says, enlarge the space for your tent, extend the curtains of your dwelling, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, make your tent pegs firm, for you will spread out to the right and the left. Your descendants will possess the nations and inhabit the desolated cities. So because of disobedience, the children of Israel who had been given the land to live in were then dispersed throughout, especially the northern kingdom first. And then you would think that the southern kingdom would learn their lesson, which was two of the 12 nations. You'd think they would have learned their lesson, but no, they didn't. And they went off into captivity in the Babylonian captivity. The northern tribes went into captivity, into the Assyrian captivity, but the difference was for the Babylonian captivity, Jehovah said he would bring them back. For those the 10 tribes in the north that went into captivity, they had been so disobedient that Jehovah said, I will bring you back, but it'll be at the time of Mashiach, or at the time that Messiah comes to rule the earth. Yeshua came, but he didn't come to rule at that particular time, but to cleanse us from our sin and make a new covenant promise to us that he was going to write this word on our hearts and instill it within us. And so this particular lesson or this poetic prophecy of Isaiah goes on to say, don't be afraid, for you won't be ashamed. Don't be discouraged, for you won't be disgraced. You will forget the shame of your youth. No longer remember the dishonor of being widowed, for your husband is your maker. Jehovah Zavuot is his name, or the Most High. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He will be called the Elohim of all the earth. This is what the children of Israel were supposed to teach the rest of the world, but rather than being an example of what Jehovah had instructed them to do, they took on the ways of the world and therefore were sent into exile. The northern kingdom not to be brought back until Messiah comes. The southern kingdom went into captivity for 70 years to the Babylonian captivity, but they were brought back in the land. And it is that return that was about 490 years before Yeshua comes on the scene. And so it was the kingdom, as we know, of Judah that was brought back at the time of Yeshua on the earth. But all 12 tribes will be brought back together in the land a future day when Messiah comes, as we read in Revelations. When he comes back, he's coming back with an iron hand, and he is going to rule this time. Goes on in verse 6 to say, for Jehovah has called you back. Isaiah is telling him, you'll come back. Like a wife abandoned and grief-stricken, a wife married in her youth cannot be rejected, says your Elohim. Briefly, verse 7, I abandon you, but with great compassion, I am taking you back. I was angry for a moment and hid my face from you, but with everlasting grace, I will have compassion on you, says Jehovah, your Redeemer. So you see where it's saying that Jehovah is our Redeemer, along with what? Yeshua is our Redeemer. He says in verse 9, for me, this is like Noah's flood. So here's where it directly ties into what our lesson is for today in terms of the flood, where he destroyed all the earth. But before he made the announcement he was going to destroy it, he said that Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives would not die. That's the remnant that would not perish from the earth, and they will then repopulate the earth. So we are all descendants of Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. He says, just as I swore that no flood like Noah's would ever again cover the earth, So now I swear that never again will I be angry with you or rebuke you. For the mountains may leave and the hills be removed, but my grace will never leave you, and my covenant of peace will not be removed, says Jehovah, who has compassion on you. So it's the same concept that we see of what took place in the flood, with all manner of life being destroyed. And as we get into some of what Jubilees is going to reveal to us, we're going to see why we might think that the animals, what did they do? What? There could have been a different way to destroy all men and just keep Noah and not do the animals. But hold on, I gotta let somebody in. But he chose. Yeah, put yourself on mute. But he chose to do it by what we're going to find out, that the animals had been so messed up. You got to mute yourself. The animals had been so messed up that they needed to be restarted. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we go through our lesson on tonight. So that's the companion study. And that lesson in itself could take a full hour of commentary and study if we went into it that way, but we're not going to do that on tonight. Now we're going to get into our first slide, which once again went from Adam all the way to Noah. As you look at the whole lifespan of this particular chart, you will notice that Adam died not too long before Noah was born. So all of this time that Adam lived 930 years, all of this time, as you look at Seth right up under him, you see that Seth lived where? Right up to the flood. Then you look at Enos, then Canaan, then Mahalalel, then Jared, then Enoch. Well, you see, when in Enoch, everyone was still alive that lived of the priestly line when Enoch walked the earth. And remember that Enoch, it said, God, Jehovah took him. So the difference between what we've understood previously is that we didn't make the connection, because when Adam dies, we think that that's it. And then Seth is, no, we can look and see how it was all overlapping. And so there was a righteous seed passed down from Adam as he taught them the sacrificial system, and the angels taught them the sacrificial system. So you'll see that all of these things that Moses then later records, all of these things were known earlier. And we're going to see that as we get into some of the things of Jubilees on tonight. But we did want to point out that two people, Methuselah, you see where Methuselah lived during the time of Noah, and in fact, he didn't die until just before the flood. Remember, Moses was 500 years old when his children were born. But the flood didn't happen until Noah was 600 years old. And so during that 100-year period, he had his three sons. But you can see that right up until the flood, which is what we see there, you see that Methuselah lived longer than Lamech. And Lamech was the father of Noah. So Methuselah then would tell Lamech what to name Noah, because the understanding of what was getting ready to transpire, you can see from year 500 almost to 600, both Lamech and Methuselah were still alive. And so during this period of time, as they understand the earth is going to be destroyed by flood, as Noah was in fact going around and telling everybody that's what was going to happen. Then we can see in our chart the overlapping. So this information was passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation, all the way to the 10th generation, what brought us to Noah. And then there's another chart, I'll try to put it in there next week, that will bring us all the way to the 20th generation, which will be Abraham, and which we will touch on as we conclude our lesson for tonight. But we can see where this information would be passed on. Now, last week we also looked at in the book of Jubilees how the angels, the messengers from Jehovah that would come down and talk to man and guide man. Well, one of the problems was some of those angels came and took daughters from humans, which they were not. Took on flesh and had children by women. They were not supposed to do that. And we're going to see in Jubilees where Jehovah, in being distraught with everything, the first line of people were these angels who disobeyed the order established by creation. The order was they were not supposed to come together with women and father children. But they were disobedient, disobeyed the order of creation, and therefore began to mix seed. And in their mixing of seed, they made the earth quickly get into the place to where it needed to be destroyed, because this mixing of seed was totally eliminating the order that Jehovah had established for his creation. And so you can see that Methuselah and Lamech were both what? They were alive doing the prophetic work of Noah, telling the world that there was going to be a flood. Both Methuselah and Lamech, his father, died just prior to the flood. Methuselah closer to the flood date even than Lamech. And so this information was passed down. All the information that Methuselah had, he would have plenty of time to give that information to Lamech, and Lamech to take that information and give. So they're all talking. They're all talking, and they would have Jared. Jared was there, and they would have Mahalalel. He was still alive at the birth of Noah. And then we go all the way up to Enos and see that it was about that time that Noah is born, all the way up to who? Seth. And so we can understand a little bit more the length of time and what was going on. So let's get into our lesson on tonight. So as we look at chapter 6, verse 9, and we go all the way to verse 22, when we look at verse 22, we see at verse 21, it says, also take from all kinds of food that are eaten and collect it for yourself. It is to be food for you and for them. This is what Noah did. He did all that God ordered him to do. So for this whole period of time, and what Jubilees actually reveals is that Noah went around telling the world and prophesying to the world that the flood was going to come. But he didn't really start building the ark right away. He was gathering materials. He was doing all of those things. And it was only about 5 or 6 years before an actual flood that he began to construct the boat, which at that time his sons would be what? There and able, and their wives would be able to help him build the ark. And so since they were born during that 100-year period between when Noah actually got the word and when he actually got onto the ark, we're going to see that he was telling the world that this was going to happen, but it had never rained. So when you're going around telling everybody it's going to rain and it had never rained, then you see the problem. Well, as we look at our outline, it says that Noah was informed by Elohim, by the Creator, that a Mabu, or a flood, will soon destroy all of civilization, and only Noah and his immediate family would survive in a teva. Now, it's amazing that the word teva means ark, but it also in Hebrew has the same root as word. So the word protected them from death. And it's the same thing Yeshua came to do, is what? To die and protect us from death. So the ark, or the teva, for Noah is the ark for Moses, and is later the word that became flesh. And so we see that connection and that order that was established by the Creator even before there was creation. And so we look at Jubilees chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, as we see in our outline. Where's my 6 and 10? Okay, let me get that first. All right. What happened to that? Okay. And it says right here in chapter 5, verse 6, it said, and against the angels whom he had sent upon the earth, he was exceedingly wroth, and he gave commandment to root them out of all their dominion. And he bade us to bind them. So you see, the other angels are coming to do what? To bind them in the depths of the earth. And behold, they are bound in the midst of them and are kept separate. Remember, in Revelations, he's going to open that up. After Yeshua's 1,000-year reign, he's going to open that up, and they're going to come out and deceive man one more time. But then he's going to destroy them all forever. They're going in the lake after that. He goes on and says in verse 7, and against their sons went forth a command from before his face, that they should be smitten with the sword and be removed from under heaven. And he said, my spirit shall not always abide on men. We saw that in our note for today. For they also are flesh, and their days shall be 120 years. And he sent his sword into their midst, and that each should slay his neighbor, and they began to slay each other till they all fell by the sword and were destroyed from the earth. So these giants that we just briefly touched on in chapter 6 of Genesis, going towards the end, chapter 8, we got a little bit more information last time and more information this time about these angelic beings that took on flesh and then began to cohabitate with the women. And what did it have to be? It had to be voluntary. Didn't say they raped them. No, women were, hey, just like with Eve, they were deceived and began to live with them and have babies by them. And it was so evil that because they were these fallen angels, they were so evil that they began, the Lord said, okay, now they're going to go and destroy each other. So he makes that pronouncement. In verse 9, it says, he sent his sword into their midst, that each should slay his neighbor, and they began to slay each other till they all fell by the sword and were destroyed from the earth. And their fathers were witness of their destruction. And after this, they were bound in the depths of the earth forever, until the day of the great condemnation, when judgment is executed on all those who have corrupted their ways and their works before Yah or Yehovah. And so we can see then that Jubilees gives us more information as to why the earth was so wicked. And these fallen angels, if you read, excuse me, Jubilees and Enoch, you'll see they were doing some terrible things. I mean, they were teaching evil. And I think we're going to get into that in one of our notes in Jubilees, or as we go back to 5, 22, and 23, it says, and Noah made the ark in all respects as he commanded him. In the 27th Jubilee of years, in the 5th week, in the 5th year, on the new moon of the first month. And that year would have been 1307 from creation. That will be 27 times 50. And we would get to what he says is what, the 27th Jubilee of years, and the 5th week would be like 5 years. And he entered in the 6th year thereof. So he worked on it for over 5 years. And then on the 6th year, he then did what? And he entered in the 6th year, 1308, in the 2nd month, on the new moon of the 2nd month. So you see, the moon and following these things was the original order that Jehovah had established. That's why, as his children, we need to get into more understanding of this moon cycle and all of these things, because we can look up and see. We can understand when the new moon is, we can understand when the full moon is, and we can understand when the full moon descends and becomes getting ready again for the new moon, which is basically you don't see anything but a sliver. So this is why we study Torah, and this is why we want to bring this information out, that these are things that his children understood back then. They were disobedient in that they began to cohabitate with these demons, but it's important because that's why Torah is important. From there, we're going to go into our second part of our session, where it talks about the animals that went on board, and we're going to see some information there that is also fascinating information. We remember now, after the flood, right? He entered in the 6th year, and he's going to come back. A year later, he's going to come out of the flood. So that would be like 1309. So year 1309 from creation, then Noah is told to leave the ark. So with that, we're going to get into the second part of our session, where it talks about the animal, and we'll notice that's from Genesis 6, 1 through 16. 7, 1 through 16. And it starts off by saying, Jehovah said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone in this generation are righteous before me. He didn't say you and your children, but they were under the covering of Noah. And so therefore, he says, they will get into the ark with you. Nobody else gonna get in. And we know that Jehovah himself sealed it up so that they couldn't get in. But it still hadn't rained yet. And so the people still thought Noah was a crook. And so one thing of importance we look at here, he says, and Noah was commanded to take 7 pairs of each species of what we call clean animals. So you see, this information was passed down from Adam all the way through the priestly line. They passed this information down. Just had an opportunity to know it, but they didn't obey it. But the priestly line obeyed it, even though they were going to be destroyed along with everyone, but they had lived a long time. Methuselah lived longer than anyone. And so we can see then the flow of information. And so we look at it and we are devoid of time. And therefore, we don't really understand what's going on. But as we go into our next session, we're going to see that Noah and his family understood the clean animals from the unclean. We're going to see then, even as we let's look at Enoch. Okay, Enoch gives us even more information on these demons, these demonic angels that took on flesh and began to cohabitate with women and produce these giants. And we're going to see what else they did while they were here. He said, and all the others together with them took unto themselves wives. Now, in the book of Enoch, Enoch tells you names and everything. So you really get a lot of information in reading the book of Enoch because he calls them by name. And so we know that Enoch did what? He walked with God. He walked with God and then he was no more. And it is believed that the writing down of everything began with Enoch telling him, y'all messing up so much that we're going to write this information down so that just as Moses had to write it down, we're going to write this down so that you can study it and understand what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. And so as we go on, it said, they took unto themselves wives. They made a pact that they would go to the earth. They knew it was wrong. They made a pact, but they were falling already, that they would go to the earth. But they said, we all got to go. We can't have a few of us going. Remember, a third of the angels were kicked out with Satan. And so many of them, this is about 200 and some of them, they came and they said, we're going to make this pact and we're going to go down there and enjoy ourselves. But look at what they did. And they began to go into them and defile themselves with them. And they taught them what? Charms, enchantment, and cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. So you see these angels were teaching them demonic information, how to mess with things, because they knew the way, but they had chosen to do what? Be disobedient. So they were teaching charms, enchantments, roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And so they were crossbreeding and doing all kind of things. It says, and they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells. They said these people were 300, 400 feet tall. They would grow to that size. And it says, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. So you can see when Jehovah said how evil the earth was, these angels had come and these women had cohabitated with them and whatever else they were doing. And so therefore they had corrupted the order that Jehovah had established for his creation. It said they turned against and they began to be cannibals on the earth. They were cannibalistic. They were devouring everything. I mean, the further you get away from what? The light, and you're in that darkness, just like with we have what? We have the blessings and the curses. You notice how the curses just keep multiplying and multiplying. Well, these angels just had this information. They taught them how to crossbreed and do all kind of crazy things with animals. So we see the unicorn and all that. Well, we think that's just a myth. But these angels had taught them to do that. How they could mix breed and do all of these things. And then it says, and they began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. So all of these things, these angels and these people that they were living with and cohabitating with began to do all of these things. And it says, then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Jehovah God said, that's when we read earlier in Jubilees where they began to turn on one another. And the angels were saying, we need to go down there and take care of this stuff. So some of them were killed by Michael and them. And as you go into Enoch, he put names on them. They came down and began to handle some of these lawless ones. And so the second part of our story goes into that. And then we get into Jubilees chapter 5, verses 25 through 27, as now the ark has been sealed and the rain is going to start. And it says, and the floodgates began to pour down water from the heaven 40 days and 40 nights. And the mountains of the deep also sent up waters. Remember in Genesis chapter 1, when we looked at day 2, the separation of the waters, where the waters above and the waters beneath were separated. Well, and during this period of time, you can think 40 days, 40 nights, I don't care how much it rained, it ain't gonna be taller than the mountains. But when you unleash the fountains of water that were separated in the heavens, because there had never been rain before the time of the flood. And then it said the earth itself released all of those waters that were separated. So it would be like a major tsunami just coming and swallowing everything up. He says, and verse 26 says, and the waters increased upon the earth. 15 cubits did the waters rise above all the mountains, and the ark was lifted up above the earth. Now, in my translation, it lets me know that the waters came up 22 and a half feet higher than the highest mountain peak. 22 and a half feet higher than the highest mountain peak, the water rose. And the ark moved upon the face of the waters, and the water prevailed on the face of the earth 5 months, 150 days. When you look at I don't know exactly what your translation says, but mine says in verse 17 that the flood was 40 days on the earth. The water grew higher and floated the ark, so that it was lifted up off the earth. Then it says in verse, when the water covered the mountains by more than 22 and a half feet. All living things that are moved on the earth perished. Birds, livestock, animals, insects, and every human being. So we can see then why all the animals were included in those that had been corrupted, because they had been corrupted by man and just commingling with these fallen angels, and how they then taught them all of this mixing of how to mix animals and to mix foods and to mix plants. And they couldn't be satisfied in their eating. And we just read where they began to devour one another because they couldn't be satisfied. They were so large, so evil, and so flesh orientated. So we can see then why in the second part of our session, going down to verse 16 all the way to verse 20, that why Jehovah said that the thoughts of man was evil in that they were destroying the order of creation completely. And then we get into the third part of our session where it talks about how long they were, in fact, on the ark. And it says at the bottom of your outline, after 1 full year in the Teva, the earth had dried. So we know that he went in on the 600th year and he didn't come out until the 601st year. So for 1 year, completely, the earth, basically after them 40 days and 40 nights, the water was high enough to kill everything. But for 5 more months, the waters stayed that high. Then for the next 5 months or so, the waters begin to subside. And by the end of that first year, the earth had began the deep, all those waters that had been loosed out from the depths went back into their proper order. Because now the proper order, and Jehovah says that he's going to, the seasons and all of that are going to get back in their order. Unfortunately, some of the animals and some of the sons of Noah and their wives still had some of the DNA of those negative seed from what the fallen angels had done on the earth. So if we look at our next slide, which we go all the way to what? Chapter 8, verse 14. And when you look at that, you'll see it was on the 27th day of the second month that the earth was dry. Then Jehovah said to Noah, go out from the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you, and bring out with you every living thing you have with you. So he was told then, remember he did, you'll see also that he sent the raven out, and then he sent the dove out. We see all of that, and finally the dove came back with a leaf, and so then he knew that the earth had subsided, but he wanted to make certain. So then we'll see that as we look at Jubilees chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, it says, and on the new moon of the third month, he went forth from the ark, and he built an altar on that mountain. And he made atonement for the earth, and took a kid and made atonement for all the guilt of the earth. For everything that had been on it had been destroyed, save those that were in the ark with Noah. So when he comes out of the ark, it is right about Shavuot, or what we call in English Pentecost. This is when he comes out, and he offers a sacrifice on Pentecost to deal with the Jehovah, what? Keeping them alive, maintaining that, but atoning for, basically repenting for all that the earth had done, everything that had been happening with the population of the earth, and for all those that were coming out of the ark. He wanted them to be blessed. And so in doing this, it's like saying, bless us for what the earth has done, and you have cleansed it from all unrighteousness. And so with that, we get into the fourth session, which picks up in Genesis 8, verse 15, where Jehovah tells them to leave the ark, and Noah builds the altar and offered sacrifices. He said, instead, the regular seasons, which had not functioned during the year of the flood, would continue perpetually. So once again, the order that had been established before all these demonic angels came and with man's agreement began to do all kinds of things contrary to the word and what they had been instructed to do, so bad that Jehovah sent the angels down to capture them, those that hadn't killed each other, capture them and put them into abyss. And remember, they're not coming out until after the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. And it talks about he's going to open up that pit and that's how evil they are. And so they can't come out until the pit will be open for them to one more time, because they're coming out for judgment. And once again, they're going to entice man to sin. But this time will be the last time. So we look at that all the way to chapter 9, verse 7. And then we get the command of God in verse 7. He says, and be fruitful and multiply and swarm on the earth and multiply on it. So even as we get through the fourth part of our lesson, we see that they were told to be fruitful and multiply. And so that means in obedience, they're going to do that, and therefore they will multiply rapidly. And so then we look at Jubilees 6, verses 10 through 14, and let's see what we get from our fourth part of our session. And Noah and his sons swore that they would not eat any blood that was in any flesh, and he made a covenant before Yah Elohim, or Jehovah Elohim, forever throughout all the generations of the earth in this month. Once again, that's the month of Shavuot. On this account, he spake to thee that thou shouldest make a covenant with the children of Israel in this month upon the mountain with an oath, and that thou shouldest sprinkle blood upon them because of all the words of the covenant which Yah made with them forever. And so we talk about the Noahide laws and the fact that they renewed the covenant on Shavuot after the flood. And he says, and this testimony is written concerning you, that you should observe it continually, so that you should not eat on any day any blood of beasts, birds, cattle, during all the days of the earth. And the man who eats the blood of the beast or of cattle or birds during all the days of the earth, he and his seed shall be rooted out of the land. And do thou command the children of Israel to eat no blood, so that their names and their seed may be before Jehovah our Elohim continually. And then in verse 14, and for this law there is no limit of days, for it is forever. So that's why we want to understand what Shavuot, what we should be doing on Shavuot, what Shavuot represents, and then we can look back in Jubilees and we get even more information about Shavuot and the importance of it. Why? Because the whole gathering of the children of Israel at Mount Sinai was on Shavuot. So we see that it was all the way back to Adam. They understood Shavuot, and it was passed down. But what they did is not do it. And of course, everything Enoch wrote down probably got destroyed with the flood. Although you could see there were cave drawings and things in stone where we could see, like even the unicorn, we could see where they ran on the earth. He goes on and said, every day and at the time of morning and evening, they shall seek forgiveness on your behalf perpetually before Jehovah, that they may keep and not be rooted out. So there's the morning sacrifice, and then there's the evening sacrifice. And all of those are pointing to the fact of the covenant that Jehovah made with man way back with Adam, all the way up until this time. And then with Moses, then what? Brings back out to the children of Israel in written form for man from that day forward. So it doesn't mean we don't celebrate it now. It means even more so we should celebrate it now. Because when Yeshua comes back, you're definitely going to be celebrating it then. Then we go into the fifth part of our lesson, and which will be from Genesis 9, verse 8 to verse 17. Then he's going to talk about some parts of the covenant. It said Elohim designated the rainbow as the sign of this covenant. So when we see that rainbow in the sky, that should encourage us in terms of what? Our redemption. Because he said this sign is part of what? Covenant. It's a covenant relationship. So just as Yeshua is coming back and is going to rule with an iron hand, then the rainbow not only points to the fact that he's not going to destroy the earth by flood, by water anymore, but it demonstrates the covenant relationship that the children of God have with the Creator, Jehovah. So then we'll see in Jubilee 6, verses 18, he says, He set his bow in the cloud for a sign of the eternal covenant, that there should not again be a flood on the earth to destroy it all the days of the earth. For this reason, it is ordained and written on the heavenly tablets that they should celebrate the Feast of Weeks in this month once a year. What is the Feast of Weeks? That's the 49 days between the celebration of unleavened bread leading into what? Shavuot or Pentecost. That's the weeks. It says we should renew covenant understanding every year on that day. So even though we can't offer animal sacrifices because there's no temple anymore, we can still do what? Celebrate the feast and remind each other of what it means and how deeply that is something that Jehovah wants us to do. And it said that this whole festival was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation. And Noah and his sons observed it for 7 jubilees and 1 week of years. So 7 jubilees would be what? 350 years. So in 350 years, what? Which is how long Noah lived after the flood. So the entire life of Noah, his sons then celebrated Shavuot. And from the day of Noah's death, his sons did away with it until the days of Abraham, and his sons also ate blood. So we could see then that Jubilees points out information that we never even thought about. Why? Because we weren't even taught concerning the understanding of Shavuot and how we as children of God are supposed to celebrate that each year, and how we're supposed to understand the moon and the changes in the moon, because they all point to an understanding of these, what we call the Moedim, or the set apart days that the Creator set aside. And it says, what does he say here? Was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation. So Adam knew about Shavuot. Adam celebrated. Then when we go down that lineage all the way to Noah, all of the priestly line understood the value of Shavuot and the festival of weeks. With that, I know our time is running out. We're getting into the 6th part of our outline, where Noah plants a vineyard. He's going to make wine. He's going to get drunk and fall into a deep drunken slumber, and while he was not clothed. Well, we know that once again, they knew the rules. Moses wasn't the first one to write this down. Enoch wrote it all down for man. So man had the understanding. It was passed on by word of mouth. All that Moses wrote down in the Torah, man had just done away with it, just like Noah's sons did after Noah died. And if you go and read more of Jubilee, which I believe we're going to get in a little bit of today, you'll see where he told them. He said, look, don't forget these important Moedim, these important days. Celebrate them to honor the covenant that we made with the Creator of the universe. We got angels coming down and reminding us to celebrate and do these things. And so he foresaw that they were going to turn away after his death. But he had what? 350 years to teach and work with them, and still many of them are going to be disobedient, but a lot of people came on the earth in those 350 years. And so he had an opportunity to teach all of them about the festivals of Moedim. So in chapter 9, verse 18, all the way to chapter 10, verse 32 is where we learn about how Noah cursed Canaan and then blessed Shem, and Japheth. Notice he could not curse Ham. Why? Because God had already blessed him. So he didn't curse Ham. He put a curse upon his son, Canaan. He didn't curse the other sons of Ham. He cursed Canaan. And if we go through, we're going to learn a whole lot more about what that ends up being about. So as we look at chapter 9, verse 18, we'll see that Jehovah tells him that's the covenant sign. And then in verse 18, he says in chapter 9, the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and the whole earth was populated by them. So all of this madness and this, there were different ethnic groups, but there was only one race, and that was the human race. And the human race was fathered by Noah and his sons. So we're all descendants of Noah and his sons. But once again, we got some spoiled people going around trying to create a concept of race. So with that, we see then that Noah was going to go into this sleep. He's going to plant a vineyard. When you study both Jubilees and other aspects of our study, it tells you that the earth, those grapes were different than what grapes were before the flood. Why? Because of all that mixing and stuff that had gone on. So it was a little bit different, and Noah then gets drunk because he drank too much. And then we get into Jubilees, chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, and it says in the 7th week in the first year, now we're in 1317. When did he come out of the ark? That was 1309. So 8 years have passed. In this Jubilee, Noah planted vine. So he didn't do it right away. Why? Well, once again, we're going to learn why he didn't do it right away. Why? Because that's why children of Israel were taught when you went into the land, planted your trees, you didn't eat from them until the 5th year. The first 3 years, you didn't do nothing to it. The 4th year, the crop belonged to Jehovah. So it was all part of your giving. And then in the 5th year, you could now eat it and commercially use it to make things and do all of that. But for the first few years, you couldn't. And so he didn't just get out and plant right away. No, because he understood it's going to be a time before I'm going to be able to, what, even eat it. And they produce fruit in the 4th year. So in the 4th year, 1320, he guarded it in this year into the 7th month. What happens in the 7th month? That is what? That is basically a Jubilee month. So that's when the Jubilee starts, is in the 7th month, the blowing of the trumpets. He said he made wine therefrom and put it in a vessel and kept it until the 5th year. So it had plenty of time to ferment until the new moon of the 1st month. All right. And he celebrated with joy the day of this feast. What feast takes place in the 1st month? That's the feast of Pesach and unleavened bread. So it was in that time. That's a lot of wine. Drinking wine for 7 to 8 days. So he got drunk. He made a burnt sacrifice unto Yah, 1 young ox, 1 ram, 7 sheep, each a year old, and a can of the goats, that he might make atonement thereby for himself and his sons. And so we see then that he makes atonement in the 7th month, which is what? Yom Kippur. So during Yom Kippur, he made atonement for himself and his son. And what Moses taught the children of Israel to do is the high priest would go behind the curtain and make atonement for himself, his family, the other priests, and then for all the other people, and then for all of the ornaments and everything in and around the tabernacle and later the temple. So this is the feast that was being celebrated. And so then we're going to get to 13 and 16. And Ham knew that his father had cursed his younger son, and he was displeased that he had cursed his son. Now, Ham was wrong for what? You were forbidden to see the nakedness of your father. But he went in there and saw him and then mocked him to his other brothers, and they went by and walked backwards, we learn from the scriptures, and covered him up. When his father awakened, then he realizes, probably after finding out he'd been covered up and what had gone down, what Ham had done. And so then he curses Canaan. He cannot curse Ham. And he parted from his father. So he left. This is the dispersal of the nations. He and his sons with him. Cush was his son. Mizraim was his son, which later became Egypt. Put was his son, and Canaan was his son. So he had these 4 sons, and they had sons, and there's a lineage for all of them. And you get into that in chapter 10, which is the table of nations. And he built for himself a city and called the name after the name of his wife, Nelat Tamaru. And Japheth saw it and became envious of his brother. So remember, the first ones to build cities and everything were from the lineage of Ham. Japheth saw it and became envious of his brother, and he too built for himself a city, and he called its name after the name of his wife, Adattaneses. And Shem grew up with his father Noah. So Shem is the priestly line now. And so he hanging close to his dad, and he built a city close to his father on the mountain, and he too called its name after the name of his wife, Sadat Quetelabah. And so it's interesting that these men were naming the cities after their wives. So that's something that we would never have heard and understood from what we had been studying up to this point. And now as we get through chapter 11, chapter 10 is the table of nations, and it goes through the lineages of the sons of Noah, both Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we find in Jubilees where Noah is speaking to his sons before his death. Now we're going to look at the 7th part. It says the story of Babel. Remember, that was built by the descendants of Ham. They made the first cities. And so it goes on and says, Noah's descendants gathered in the Babylonian valley and started building a tower. So these descendants, most likely of Ham and Shem, who had joined up to build cities, going to build this tower in an attempt to reach the heaven. Elohim disrupted their plan by causing them each to speak a different language. So up until that time, everybody spoke the same language. Why? Because their father and their fathers spoke one language, and it is believed that was Hebrew. But Jehovah comes down and separates the language so that that evil that they were trying to do wouldn't multiply so rapidly. So in his mercy, he did that. And he goes on to say that the Torah then lists the 10 generations of Shem's descendants, the 10th generation, all the way to Abram, later known as Abraham, who married Sarah. So that's where we end our lesson in chapter 11, verse 32. Actually, we go down, I think it's verse 27. And it says, verse 29, then Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. We keep that in mind, Milcah and Sarah. We're going to see how they interplay and what happens later to Jacob and also to the wife of Isaac. Then it goes on, says that he was the father of Milcah and of Iscah. Sarai was barren, she had no child. Terah, which is the father of Abraham, took his son Abraham, his son Haran's son Lot, because Haran had died, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, of his son Abram's wife. And they left Ur of the Chaldean to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they stayed there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. Well, let's see what Jubilee will do to add to our story. Noah, speaking to his sons, for 3 years the fruit of everything that is eaten will not be gathered. And in the 4th year, its fruit will be accounted holy, and they will offer the first fruits acceptable before the Most High Elohim, who created heaven and earth and all things. Let them offer in abundance in the first of the wine and oil as first fruits on the altar of Yah or Jehovah, who receives it. And what is left after that, the servants of the house of Yah eat before the altar which receives it. So this is the same thing that Moses is writing down, that Noah is speaking to his sons about what they're supposed to do. Remember, the first of the sons usually is the priestly line, all the way up until the sin of the golden calf. And in the 5th year, make you release it in righteousness and uprightness, and ye shall be righteous, and all that you plant shall prosper. But thus did Enoch, the father of your father, commanded Methuselah, his son, and Methuselah, his son, Lamech. And Lamech commanded me. Lamech is the father of Noah, all the things which his fathers commanded him. So this lets us know that all of this information had been available to them, had been written down, but now once again is being passed along orally. And so this information that would be given to Abraham would not necessarily be strange to him, even though he came from an idolatrous family. The knowledge of what was available to him, and he took that knowledge, and for that reason, he was able to leave his father and go into another land as the Creator commanded him to do, because he then becomes in line of the priestly line. So I had to kind of rush through that last part, but once again, I would ask you, you can get it online, to go and get the book. Oh, let me get back into the share and get out of the share screen. Yeah, you can get the book and order books of the Ethiopian Bible. You can order that, you can get it. It does not, I know we've been taught that it wasn't part of the Protestant canon, but once again, for 800 years before the Protestant canon of the 1600s, it was part of the Ethiopian Bible, and also many of the books were part of the Catholic Bible, which was the universal church up until the time of the split to become Protestant and Catholic. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining me on our lesson for tonight. Next week, we'll come together again. Lesson 3, we just been introduced in chapter 11, Abraham. Now we're going to change the story. The priestly line going through Abraham, through his sons, and how that brings us up to the time of Moshe, which will be in the book of Shemot or Exodus. So thank you so much for joining us. Everyone hold their hands out towards the screen and towards one another. From the priestly blessing of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. May Jehovah bless you and keep you. May Jehovah make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may Jehovah lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And with that, thank you so much. If you have any questions about anything we've done, we have our link, our link that you can, in fact, ask a question about, and I will go back to the link and I will answer the question, and everybody will see the question, and everybody will get an opportunity to then respond and understand the answer. And that will generate discussion as we go from one lesson to the next. Then we'll have that additional information that we'll try to answer the questions as best we can or go find the answer. With that, I want to say shalom. See you next week. And thank you so much for joining me.